So again, thanks for joining us. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Rebecca Walker Reczek is the Ohio State University Fisher College of Business H. Lee Buck Matthews Professor of Marketing. We're delighted to have her with us today. She has a PhD from University of Texas at Austin, and her area of specialty is consumer behavior, particularly lay theories, inference making, self-perception, and ethical decision making, which will be the focus, I think, for most of her talk today. She also looks at consumer well-being in the areas of food, health, and sustainability. She has published many articles in top refereed journals. She is an associate editor of the Journal of Consumer Research and the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. She's won national awards and has appeared on national media. And she is one of our inaugural 2018 MSI Scholars. So we're very pleased to have Rebecca with us today to talk about why consumers don't always shop ethically. Rebecca?
All right, thank you, Earl, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to have a chance to share my research on what I call the psychological barriers to ethical consumption with a wider audience. So before I get into talking about that, I just wanted to give you a little bit more background on the type of research that I do. I'm a consumer psychologist, so that means my primary research method is experiments conducted in the behavioral lab at Fisher's College of Business. You can see I'm not there right now. I'm in my home office / guest bedroom, but when I am in the lab, this is what our lab looks like. So we invite undergraduate students, graduate students, people from the community into the lab to take part in consumer behavior experiments. And you can see that these participants are sitting at computers and there's dividers between the stations. And that's because often what's happening in these experiments is we have more than one condition. So people are looking at different versions of some kind of marketing stimulus, whether it's an ad or a product description, and they're responding, and then we can compare differences across dependent variables. And the type of research that I'm often running in the lab is I'm looking at consumer decision-making about ethical and sustainable products. And the reason I find this so interesting is there are these psychological barriers to ethical consumption that I'm going to tell you about, but I find it particularly fascinating that people don't always act on their ethical and moral values in the marketplace, because most people actually do want to be good. If we look at the child development literature, after a certain stage in development, most children want to make the right decision. This is also true of mature adults, that most of us, with the possible exception of sociopaths, have a desire to make good moral choices to further the outcomes of creatures other than themselves, to be pro-social. So if all of that is true, it should feel good to express our moral values through our purchases. But that is not always what we see happening in the marketplace. Sometimes products that are not particularly ethical, that harm the environment, that use unfair labor practices are still successful. And people don't always even think about ethical issues when they're making day-to-day purchases. So that's what my research tries to look at, is to identify what are the psychological barriers that stop people from acting on those moral values when they're making purchases. And I'm going to talk about two main sources of conflict that I've examined in my research that I think stop people from expressing those ethical values when they purchase. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this idea of a general conflict between the want self and the should self. And this is an idea drawn from social psychology, that when people make decisions, they often act as if there are two versions of the self. And the should self is the version of ourself that thinks about what's the right thing to do, is able to focus on longer term outcomes, that isn't just thinking in the moment, what do I want to do, but rather thinking about what should I do, what's best for my long-term goals, or what's best for other people, or even the broader society, versus the want self is more focused on the immediate, the visceral, the affective response. And this want should self is often talked about in terms of self-control dilemmas. So for example, if someone's trying to decide between, say, an apple and a piece of cake for a snack, the should self might be able to look at those two things and say, I really should choose the apple because that's going to be more consistent with my long-term goals for health and wellness. But the want self looks at the two options and says, I want the cake. That would be great, and doesn't think about any of these long-term consequences. And if you've ever found yourself in that situation and you choose the cake instead of the apple, you know that often the want self triumphs over the should self in these self-control dilemmas. So how does this relate to ethical purchasing in the marketplace? Well, when we think about ethical issues, something like, is a pair of jeans potentially made with child labor in an overseas facility? our should self may be capable of saying, I really should take that into account. I should make sure I'm not supporting child labor. But our want self often says, I don't want to think about those types of negative, affectively, emotionally negative issues when I'm shopping. So if we think about ethical attributes in the marketplace and the should and the want self, this is very relevant because I define ethical attributes as attributes that activate the consumer's moral self in some way. So speak to the consumer's conscience. So this could be environmental friendliness, so something made from recycled material, something that's sustainable, or like a pro-environmental, a green cleaner, or something about fair labor practices. So paying workers fair wages, not using child labor. And as I was saying, this should self might say you should care about these things when purchasing. So it's not, in my view, that people are not ethical. It's not that they want to buy things that might be made with child labor or might be made in factories, overseas factories where workers are not treated fairly. It's not that they don't care. It's just that often the want self ends up triumphing in the marketplace. And the want self might be thinking things like, nope, I want to avoid thinking about that stuff entirely so I can just buy cute clothes in peace. And there's some evidence in the literature that one of the ways people cope with this potential conflict between the want and the should self when it comes to ethical information in the marketplace is they simply choose not to find out whether products are made ethically or not. And this is called willful ignorance. So it's not that people find out and then actively don't care and disregard ethical information, just they choose not to find out among a set of products which ones were made ethically and which were not. Because if they don't find out, they don't have to deal with it. And the same consumers, if they have the information, actually would use it in their decision making. They just avoid getting it entirely. So I'm going to tell you about two research projects of mine that look at first the consequences of this willful ignorance, and then something that I call willfully ignorant memory. So I'm going to tell you first about a study that we did where we asked people to make a decision about a pair of jeans. And really they saw a set of jeans and they were told, we want you to think about which jeans you might be interested in buying out of this set of products. But to do it, because we want to simulate what it's like in the real world, you might have limited time to search for information. You can only choose 2 out of the 4 attributes to view. And consistent with that prior research showing people just don't want to think about ethical attributes, most people, when they could only pick 2, avoided finding out about the labor practice attribute, which in this case was whether the jeans were made with child labor overseas or in an overseas facility that paid fair wages and did not use child labor. What we were interested in, we were not surprised to find out that almost all participants chose not to view labor practices because they want to just avoid thinking about this issue entirely. What we did though is we had people go through this process and they picked which attributes to look at, and most of them chose, I'm going to look at say style and price or style and wash. I'm going to avoid the labor practices. And then what we had people do was to read about another consumer who did look at the attribute they had just ignored. So read about another consumer who did decide to look at labor practices, or in a control condition decided to look at a different attribute that people had ignored, which didn't have any ethical implications, and that was delivery time, whether the jeans were going to come in 3 days or 5 days. And what we were interested in, a dependent variable here, is after people had given into their want self and ignored the labor practice, how would they view someone who chose to listen to their should self and did find out which jeans were made ethically? And what we found is that consumers rated the more ethical consumer after they themselves chose not to think about the ethical attribute. They rated that more ethical consumer as less fashionable, less attractive, less sexy, more odd, more boring, more preachy. And if you look at the traits together, you can see this bar here. These are people who willfully ignored the ethical attribute were rated significantly more negatively than our control condition. People who ignored a control attribute that had nothing to do with ethicality aren't rated negatively at all. So what's going on here is this has to do with that conflict between the want self and the should self. People want to feel like they're ethical, and actually feeling ethical is a core part of our identity. So what's driving this effect is people experience a sense of threat when they find out that someone else in the same situation they were just in chose to be ethical when they didn't. They experience that as a threat to their own identity, since they do want to be moral and ethical people. And unfortunately, one of the ways that we respond to self-threat is by denigrating the source of the threat. So that's what's going on here. They're putting down the other consumer who was more ethical as a way essentially to feel better about themselves, to feel better about being threatened that they weren't as ethical as they could have been. And in another study in this same project, we looked at people who ignored a different ethical attribute, and this was whether or not a set of backpacks was made with recycled material. And we found that after putting down people who did look at this attribute when they didn't, so people did the same thing they did in our gene study, but here we measured some downstream consequences of putting down people who did look at the ethical attribute. we found that the people who had put down the people who had looked at the ethical attribute, after denigrating others, they felt less anger towards the underlying ethical issue. So they felt less concerned, basically, about potential harm to the planet. And perhaps even worse, they were then less willing to take an eco-friendly pledge themselves. So what's happening here is we experience that threat from being less ethical, and then we observe ourselves putting down someone who did look at the ethical attributes, saying, oh, well, they're just weird that they care about whether their backpack is made with recycled materials. So they see themselves doing that. And then they think, well, I must not care as much about that. And now, okay, now my actions are going to match that. So that putting down ethical others as a response to self-threats is really a short-term solution that has potentially significant future consequences. So what can we do? Well, for consumers, don't make others feel bad about their ethical choices, and question your own motives if you find yourself criticizing ethical consumers. It's hard to feel badly, but it's even harder to acknowledge that we're feeling badly for deeper rooted reasons, the sense of threat from not being as ethical as we could have, from realizing someone else listened to their should self and we did not. And another interesting implication here, I think, is that advocacy groups often catch flack in part because audiences feel threatened by their perceived moral superiority. So how you approach consumers when talking about trying to get them to be more interested in a brand that is maybe more ethical than other brands. Very important to do it in a way that doesn't make consumers feel threatened, that doesn't make your brand come across as holier than thou. We're more ethical than you. Because if consumers feel threatened, they can end up just putting the brand down rather than actually buying in and being interested in the message that you have to say, whether you're a brand or an advocacy group. And the other implication here is for companies. So you can stop social comparisons like these by providing ethical information from the start. And now I'm going to tell you about another project that suggests that when you give that ethical information really matters. Because you might think from hearing this, okay, one solution to willful ignorance and the negative consequences that can come after is just to give people ethical information from the beginning. Well, the problem with that is that when consumers see the ethical information really matters, is when we make decisions, we can make decisions with all the relevant information present, or we can make decisions where we're having to retrieve some of the information from memory. And since information about how ethically products are made is often not readily available in the marketplace, many times we're having to recall from memory whether or not products in a given set of products are actually ethically made. And the problem with that is that memory is malleable and constructive. So what that means, and Beth Loftus, whose name you see here, she's a very famous name in memory research, basically shows that memory does not work like a recording device. We may think it does, but it's not that when we encounter something that we can always just play it back exactly as it happened. It's constructive, meaning every time we retrieve something from memory, we might change something small about it without even realizing it. Even eyewitness testimony in courts is notoriously unreliable because people are kind of rebuilding an event every time they remember it. And this is especially true in ethical domains. So this is a really interesting paper showing that after people behave dishonestly, they're less likely to recall honesty pledges that they read right before the behavior. So we use this research to predict that consumers might engage in systematic, motivated forgetting of negative ethical attribute information, in particular as a coping mechanism. So our hypothesis in this project was that memory patterns are going to differ for ethical versus non-ethical attributes. So for ethical attributes, people are going to be more likely to forget poor performance on an ethical attribute. So for example, that a pair of jeans was made with child labor, than they are good performance, that a pair of jeans was made in an overseas facility that treats workers well, pays fair wages, doesn't use child labor, et cetera. So I'm going to tell you about a study we did in this project. And we did do some studies using jeans and child labor in this project. We also did this with sustainability as an attribute. So in this study, we were interested in people's memory for ethical attributes. So what we did is we asked people to read descriptions of 6 desks. And the desks differed on 3 attributes: price, quality, and wood type. And wood type was the ethical attribute here because the wood that the desk was made from either came from rainforest or came from a sustainable tree farm. And people were in our lab, they read about these desks, they answered a few questions about the desks to ensure that they'd actually read the information and processed it. And then they engaged in some distractor tasks in the lab. So they weren't asked to memorize this information at all. They just encountered it like you would encounter marketplace information in the real world. Then they did some other unrelated things. And then at the end of the lab session, we gave them a cued recall task, which means we gave them the brand name and said, just what do you remember about the desk? Write down everything that you can remember. and we coded what they wrote down. And what we were interested in was, were they correct in what they remembered about what wood the desk was made from? Was it made from rainforest, which is the poor performance on the ethical attribute, or was it made from wood harvested from a sustainable tree farm? I'm going to show you the results. So what to focus on are these two bars. What you see is that we saw significantly more correct tree farm responses than we did correct rainforest responses. So people were forgetting the negative performance much more than they were the positive performance, just like we predicted. But importantly, only the ethical attributes showed that pattern of results. For quality, we actually saw no differences in memory for desks that were high versus low quality. And then for price, we actually saw the opposite pattern of results. People had better memory for the negative performance. And we showed this across a series of studies using different attributes, using both recall and recognition. People tend to forget poor performance on an ethical attribute at a greater rate than they do good performance. And why are they doing that? It comes back to that want and that should self. If we don't have to think about whether or not something is ethical, that's great. We'd like to do that. But if someone gives us that information and we're forced to think about it, one way to get rid of potential conflict that might maybe stop us from buying the one we want, and definitely lets us just forget about not having to think all the negative things that might come up if we think about child labor and a lack of sustainability. We simply forget that it wasn't sustainable, or we forget that it was made with child labor. So what does this mean for consumers and for firms? Well, it's a barrier to the purchase of ethical products if people can't remember that maybe the competitors to your brand aren't ethical at all. And it also allows us as consumers to potentially purchase unethical products without feeling guilt or anger or any of the negative issues that can come up when thinking about brands performing poorly on ethical attributes. And as an example, something after I did this research, I thought about, do I do this in my own life? And I realized, when I am buying, say, an Apple product, I have read lots of news reports about potential, labor practice violations in the supply chain for Apple. But did I think about any of those things when I was actually buying a new iPhone? And unfortunately, I did not, right? It's easy to forget this negative performance when you are in shopping mode and listening to your want self and getting excited about a new product. So for managers, that means you really can't expect consumers, first of all, to search for information on which products are ethical, and then two, to accurately retain ethical attribute information. So this is really information that has to be provided at the point of purchase if you want consumers to use it. And again, this goes back to the idea at the very beginning. I said, consumers want to be good. It's not that people want to buy products that have negative ethical attributes. This is one of those psychological barriers. They may simply forget, but many consumers, if it's right there, the information is available as they're making the decision, much more likely to use it than if they have to search for it themselves or be expected to remember it at the time when they're making the decision versus having it provided for them. Okay, so I've spent some time talking about this first source of conflict, this general conflict between the want self and the should self. But in the time I have remaining, I want to talk a little bit more about this other source of conflict. And that is the idea that consumers often feel like there's a trade-off between their moral values and other valued end states that might be important to them in the marketplace when they're making purchases. So just as an example, I have done some research characterizing green consumers. So what do people that have strong green consumption values, what else is that correlated with? One of the things that having strong green consumption values is correlated with is actually frugality, which can be problematic for these consumers because a lot of consumers think that green products, for example, are more expensive than the traditional alternatives. So if you are someone who has really strong green consumption values, you are also very likely to be frugal. And you might feel like there's a conflict between expressing your ethical value in the marketplace and also achieving your other valued end states in the marketplace, getting a good product for a low price. So I'm going to focus not so much on this potential conflict between frugality and green consumption values, but on a perhaps related conflict. And this is a lay theory that people have about the correlation between ethical attributes and a product's non-ethical attribute. And a lay theory is a term that describes people's general understandings of how the world works. And when you're thinking about a lay theory, you can contrast it with a scientific theory. A scientific theory, especially in the natural sciences, is supposed to be something that's objectively true, And a lay theory may not be. A lay theory is a consumer or a person's understanding of the relationships that exist in the world. Oftentimes they're true in some circumstances, but not true in all circumstances. They get over applied, they can act as biases. And in research that I've done on sustainability, I've shown that people have a lay theory about ethical products, that ethical or sustainable products just aren't as strong and effective. So if you think about valued end states in the marketplace, in many product categories, what we are seeking in the product is strength, is effectiveness, that we want a product that's going to work really well. And this is a problem. If we think that sustainable products are not as strong and effective, then that makes it hard to act on your moral values in the marketplace. And I'll show you some examples of how that plays out. In the paper that we wrote on this, we called it the sustainability liability, because essentially in product categories where strength is valued, sustainable products are less likely to be chosen. It doesn't mean that sustainability is always a liability. It's actually a positive where gentleness is valued. So in one of our studies, we asked people, for example, to choose between a sustainable and a traditional alternative for a car shampoo and a baby shampoo. And for the car shampoo, people preferred the traditional alternative because this is where strength is valued. You want a strong and effective car shampoo. But when you're washing a baby, you're not necessarily looking for something super strong and effective, right? You want something that is more gentle. And so we actually saw sustainability is not a negative when choosing a baby shampoo. But this was one of the studies that we did in the lab with hypothetical choice. We also took this outside of the lab, because in addition to doing lab studies, I also do field studies where we get outside of the lab and look at people kind of in the real world. So we wanted to see, does the sustainability liability affect consumers' decision-making in a real consumption context? And this is a really interesting field study to talk about in 2020, because we elicited real choices with real consequences. This was an older study. It was done back in 2009 during the swine flu epidemic that many of you, I'm sure, will remember. And what we did in this field study is we had people make a choice between using a sustainable and a less sustainable hand sanitizer to kill the H1N1 virus. And I'll show you what this setup looked like. But we basically observed people's real choice, what they actually chose from a hand sanitizer station. This was set up in the lobby of the business school. This was done in UT Austin. And we observed only 51 people using the station over an 11-hour period. We'd probably see much higher numbers today. During the H1N1 epidemic, people weren't quite as concerned, so there wasn't as much hand sanitizer usage. This is what it looked like. We said the CDC advises use hand sanitizers as often as possible. You can see up and up white was sort of the regular hand sanitizer, and up and up green we labeled as an eco-friendly hand sanitizer. And we did rotate which one was on the left or the right, so we know that the position of the hand sanitizers didn't matter. But there was one other aspect of the experiment that did matter a lot, and that was the Confederate position. So we had a Confederate who was watching people make their choice. And in one condition, they were literally hiding behind a pillar, really surreptitiously writing down what people did so no one knew they were being observed. And in the other condition, they were literally like wearing a white lab coat with a clipboard, standing right next to this display, very obviously recording what people were doing. So I'm going to show you the results when the Confederate was nearby. So when people realized they were being observed by someone. And here you see that more people chose the sustainable hand sanitizer. But I want to show you what the results look like when people did not think they were being observed. When people didn't think they were being observed, we actually see the results flip, and people now strongly prefer the less sustainable hand sanitizer. So what's going on here is if we look at the results on the right, where the Confederate's not visible, we see that when strength is valued, and for a hand sanitizer to kill a virus, people want strength. So when strength is valued, they're choosing the not sustainable hand sanitizer. But on the left, where someone's watching them, they're not choosing the sustainable hand sanitizer because of social desirability. So that is also a concern when you're doing research on ethical and sustainable purchases. Sometimes people will tell you they'll do one thing, but then they'll actually do something else. So observing real choices can be really important because people sometimes want to look as if they do the right thing. But what was really interesting about this on the left, where the Confederate was, watching people and they knew they were being observed, so they chose the green hand sanitizer. But the other thing that the Confederate recorded, they also recorded the number of pumps that people took from the hand sanitizer. And when people chose the green hand sanitizer, when they were being watched, they tended to take more pumps of the hand sanitizer. So what's going on there is they're thinking, okay, I'm going to choose the green one because people are watching me, but I'm better take more pumps because it's not going to work as well. I need to take more. So we saw this sustainability liability play out in the real world. And what's been wild in 2020 is we have seen images like this. And what you're looking at here, this is a Target. And this is the shelving back at the beginning of the pandemic where all of the cleaners and things like Clorox wipes are stored. And what you can see is everything is sold out except for the green cleaners. And we saw headlines like this: shoppers go green to clean because there's nothing else left. And I'll tell you, as a researcher, usually we want to see our results replicated, but I was a little disappointed to see how much this replicated, because the original study was done in 2009. And when you study lay theories, they are socioculturally determined. They can shift with time. And I actually thought that in the intervening decade that more and more consumers are interested in sustainability. I thought that sustainability liability might not be as strong, but what you see here is that when strength is really valued to kill the coronavirus, we see that sustainability liability back in full force. People didn't want to choose the sustainable product. And as to whether sustainable products actually are less effective, there are some eco-friendly cleaners that are on the CDC's list of cleaners that are effective to kill the coronavirus. But what's interesting about lay theories is even when they're not true, they can still shape people's decision making. And often there is a grain of truth in lay theories, so that's where they come from in the first place. But on the one hand, looking at this, I guess it's nice to see the results replicated, but we could all have done without the circumstances that created this particular replication. And in thinking about what are the implications for marketers of the sustainability liability, basically it says firms shouldn't leave effectiveness as a missing attribute, because what happens with lay theories, the way they work is usually people are relying on a lay theory to make an inference about a missing attribute. So they're using it in a heuristic decision-making way, like, okay, I see a green cleaner or I see a green hand sanitizer. It's unclear to me how effective these things are. So I'm just going to rely on my lay theory that sustainable products aren't as effective to assume that the green one is not as effective. So what can you do? Well, one of the studies we did in this paper, we actually tested the idea, what if you give people a strength guarantee for a sustainable product? And we saw the sustainability liability essentially go away when firms made a strength guarantee for their sustainable products. And you do see some firms doing this in the marketplace. This is an example of Clorox Greenworks, where you can see they're actually leading with power before they are even mentioning the natural claim, like shockingly powerful naturally. And in some ways, they're kind of speaking to this lay theory, right? Saying it's shockingly powerful because they're acknowledging that people don't expect green products to be powerful. So it suggests that our work suggests, and you can see Clorox doing this, you have to tell people if you have a sustainable product in a category where strength is valued, you have to make sure that people understand that it actually is strong and effective. So give people a guarantee. And then another implication, some follow-up work that I did on the sustainability liability, this is less of a concern for the green consumer segment. So I saw evidence in some work I did in the Journal of Consumer Psychology that consumers with really strong green consumption values tend not to rely on this lay theory. So who are these consumers? These are people that say things like, it's important to me that the products I use don't harm the environment. My purchase habits are affected by my concern for our environment, and I'm willing to be inconvenienced in order to take actions that are more environmentally friendly. For these consumers, they engage in essentially motivated reasoning that allows them to still purchase the green product, even when they still value getting a strong and effective product in a category. And what motivated reasoning is basically processing information in a way that's consistent with your goals or consistent with what you want it to be like. It's kind of like the equivalent of, if you build it, they will come. If I want it to be strong, well, of course it's going to be strong. So we found that people actually, if they were really strong on green consumption values, rather than making inferences consistent with this lay theory that sustainable products are less effective, they did not do that. They actually inferred that sustainable products were just as effective as other products. So they're kind of rejecting the lay theory and making an inference consistent with their goals to make environmental choices in the marketplace. So if your target audience is this super green segment, sustainability liability is a little bit less of a concern. Okay, so we've talked about two big psychological barriers to ethical purchases in the marketplace. This idea of the conflicting want and should selves, and potentially conflict between your moral and ethical values and other valued end states in the marketplace, like being frugal, getting strong and effective products. But what about barriers to ethical shopping that are created by the marketplace itself? And the picture I have up here, this is a picture of an app that lets people shop with, you can see this right here, at trusted ethical ratings in the palm of your hand. And I think apps like this are great because this is one way that consumers can do exactly what our research suggests you need to make sure that you actually are making purchases consistent with your values, which is ethical information right there at the point of purchase that you can look at, whether in store or shopping online. So I love things like this. I recommend them to consumers who want to make purchases consistent with their values. The problem is the vast majority of consumers are not using apps like this. So barriers to ethical purchases created by the marketplace, I would argue there's a lack of availability of ethical information at the point of purchase. One exception, one that I see, at least as a consumer, is I do see information on seafood sustainability, but it always stands out to me because it's one of the few times I see clearly labeled sustainability or ethicality information in a retail environment. So you can see one example here on the slides. And just in general, there's not only a lack of information, but there's also a lack of consumer knowledge, standardization of terms, labels. And I also do research in the food decision-making domain. And I always compare sustainability and ethicality labeling to the food domain. And in the food domain, the nutrition facts panel is required by law to be on every individually packaged food sold in the United States. Compared to food labeling, any kind of ethicality or sustainability labeling is kind of the Wild West. And I would say there's even a lack of consensus on what bodies should create labels. Should it be industry self-regulation? Should it be individual manufacturers or retailers? Should it be third-party NGOs? Should it be policymakers? So there's really a lot of lack of clarity in the marketplace for consumers. So it makes it hard to use that information. And I would say what's next for me as a researcher and for firms thinking about ethicality and sustainability information in the marketplace, I think coming up, we're going to start to see more information about climate change in the marketplace. And this is a really interesting kind of next frontier for this type of research because it's unclear how or whether consumers make connections between their purchases and their emissions. But I wanted to share something with you that Amazon has just started doing that you might have noticed. They've started marking some items for sale as consistent with their climate pledge friendly. So not even calling them green products or eco-friendly, but saying they're consistent with Amazon's climate pledge. I don't think we know a lot yet about how consumers are going to interpret this information and where do consumers perceive responsibility for climate change mitigation, where should it fall? The consumer or the marketer? And then for the marketer, is it the manufacturer or the retailer? In a B2B context, is it the retailer or the manufacturer, a supplier versus buyer? And before I end with some takeaways from today's talk, I thought I'd share with you some research that I'm just starting to conduct. And this is work that I'm doing in partnership with Neutral, which is an extension that you can get for Chrome or Firefox that actually shows you the carbon impact report for products that you can potentially purchase on Amazon. And this is just an example of what that might look like. And one of the things I'm really interested in is you can see this information on the right, how to neutralize your CO2 impact. It shows you information as a consumer. You can actually choose to actively pay additional money to offset the carbon impact of your purchase, or you can choose to skip meat and dairy for a day or do 2 laundry loads with cold water. And based on the research that I've done on how conflict between the want and should self works in this setting, I have a hypothesis that what's going to happen when people see this information, they're going to opt not to pay for carbon offsets. They're going to say, oh yeah, I'll definitely do the thing that is easier in the future versus having to do right now, which is, oh, I'm going to skip meat and dairy for a day. I'm definitely going to wash some laundry in cold water. And then I suspect they will choose these options and then may actually forget to do them down the road. So I'm interested in kind of understanding how we can present this information to consumers in a way that will help them make better choices. And also for companies to think about what is the best way to present this information to consumers. But what I want to do now in the couple of minutes remaining is just share a few key takeaways. And unfortunately, I don't have answers. So I just saw a question pop up in the Q&A. The climate change stuff is so new. I haven't conducted those studies yet. So you have to stay tuned for answers on that. But for the key takeaways in the talk, so going back to some of the initial research I shared, be aware of how you're presenting ethical information. If consumers feel like your brand is presenting as holier than thou, it may turn them off. They may denigrate the brand, denigrate the consumers, and not want to be associated because of that sense of self-threat. So invite consumers in without inducing the sense of threat. Basically, don't tell them all your choices so far have been bad. Come to us and we'll help you make better choices. Instead, build community around good choices versus shaming bad choices. The next big takeaway I would say is thinking about that want should conflict again. Consumers often don't want to think about ethical issues while shopping because the negative side of those ethical issues is often really unpleasant. We don't want to think about children working in sweatshops when we're buying clothes. We don't want to think about the environment being harmed when we're trying to decide, what backpack to use or what desk to buy. We don't want to think about rainforest destruction. So if your product is ethical, you need to make sure that your consumers have reminders at the point of purchase if your target audience is not using one of those apps like we talked about, which most consumers at this point are not. And then the last takeaway, consumers do want to be good. So one thing I don't want people to take away from this is that, oh, consumers don't care about being ethical, because I don't think that's it at all. I think it's just there are characteristics of the marketplace itself and of how our thought processes and emotional responses work that can prevent us from being good. So consumers want to be good, but they don't always trust ethical and sustainable products to deliver. So one of the things you can do is, if you're in a product category where strength is valued, lead with strength in your marketing communications and consider measures like money back guarantees for effectiveness to reassure people, to kind of circumvent the operation of that lay theory that sustainable products are less effective. And that's actually all I have. I put my contact information up here. I know that the slides and the talk will be shared, but I wanted to make sure you guys all have that as well. And then Earl, I think, are you going to moderate a Q&A?
Yes, thanks so much, Rebecca. That was great. A lot of good information. And again, a number of people were asking about sharing the slides. There will be a recording as well on our website within the next day or so. So those of you who want to go back and review some of the information Rebecca shared, that will be there. There were quite a number of questions that came up. There was one early on. I think you actually addressed it in your subsequent remarks, but in case there are others that had a similar question, on the example you gave of people easily forgetting the ethical information that they had been exposed to earlier in the experiment. One or two people were wondering, could that have been a matter of more of attention rather than forgetting? And maybe there's a fine line between there. So maybe if you want to just restate what you believe that study demonstrated in terms of people's tendency to forget or maybe not pay attention to ethical information.
Yeah, so in that particular study that I showed you, the overall rate of remembering was pretty low, right? It was between 30 and 40%. That's because in that particular study, they only saw the information once, and then they did answer some questions about the desks. And the reason we did that was to try to ensure that they had encoded the information, which is really attention. But in subsequent studies, we had them look at the information more. And then we also tested to make sure they remembered it right after they read it, to try to rule out. So whoever asked that was a good question, because we did have to rule out that it wasn't just an attentional issue. So in some of our other studies, you saw higher rates of remembering because we really made people remember it. And that's why having them read it over and over. So we did have them basically memorize it at time one. And then we only looked at people who were correct at time one. We looked at memory failures only for those people. And even controlling for, yes, they did pay attention and process it correctly at time one, we still saw memory errors in that same pattern at time two. So from the study that I showed you, couldn't necessarily tell that, but we did deal with that in a different study in that paper. So yeah, really good question. So even if they paid attention and were right, they still show that same pattern of memory errors.
That's a great answer, Rebecca. And that also illustrates, I think, academic research at its best, which there are always unanswered questions from a given study. You pursue that further, you try to rule out alternative explanations. That's a classic textbook example of doing that type of experimental work. That's great. Helena had a question about the shampoo example that you gave. And did you determine or test willingness to pay as well as perceptions about efficacy versus sustainability and so forth? So in your various studies, maybe that one and others, what have you observed around willingness to pay for sustainable products?
Yeah, so I did not actually look at willingness to pay in that particular project. It was always either purchase intention in the hypothetical task, but not looking at how much they were willing to pay, or product usage, like in the field study with the hand sanitizer. In terms of whether people actually are willing to pay more for sustainable products, that's something that I think is going to depend on the consumer segment. I would suspect that the green, I have not measured it, but the green consumption values, the high green consumption values people are probably more likely to be willing to pay more than people that don't have strong green consumption values. But this is also something where socially desirable responding would be an issue. that if you were conducting a survey, I can see people reporting that they would be more willing to pay for green products than they actually are in the marketplace. So I would say that's something where I would look at actual purchase to see whether people actually are willing to pay more. Because sometimes with sustainability, it's a little tricky. Like you saw that difference in choice for the hand sanitizer when people were being observed versus not. So there's various ways to get around that in academic research. And one of the ways that we did in that particular paper to get around this socially desirable bias was we asked people, instead of how willing are you to purchase the product, we'd often ask things like, how willing do you think the average American is to purchase this product? And the reality is people don't know what the average American would do. So what happens is they project themselves into the average American's shoes. So I didn't measure willingness to pay in that study, but if I were going to, I would ask it using one of these projective techniques to get around this tendency for people to say, of course I would choose the sustainable product. Of course I would pay more. But then like you saw in reality in 2020, when people want a strong cleaner, they don't choose a sustainable product.
Great, that's a good point. I'm going to sort of interpolate a few questions that I'm seeing that relate to the similar issues. One of them is around the notion of what gives a company sort of the authority or permission to make some of these claims. So one individual raised a question about, Amazon making claims for its products or its practices, and some people actually see it as for various reasons, an unethical company, or at least one that raises ethical challenges. So one set of questions relates to how do you as a company establish your credibility? And I'll interpolate here that my own research in years past has shown that there's a big kind of a tension between expertise in a given area, which a company may have based on its business sector, versus having a financial stake. So you have credibility basis of your expert knowledge, but if you're in the business of selling those products, you also have a financial stake that may compromise the message. So what are your thoughts about how the company gets that credibility or platform to make these claims? And then I want to come back to a second related point.
So for general guidance, I would recommend that firms look at the FTC's green guides. Greenwashing is a concern. And for those not familiar with the term, greenwashing is kind of like whitewashing, but it's where you try to make things look green that actually aren't. And I think many times large firms in particular are accused of greenwashing because people seem to think there's an incompatibility between being a large for-profit firm and being green. And like other lay theories people have, that may be true in some cases, and other times it's not. If you are a firm trying to communicate to consumers that you have credible green claims, I think one of the best things that you can do is to partner with credible third-party organizations. There is going to be increased skepticism when the claim is coming only from your firm. And if you're making any kind of scientific claim, this is actually the FTC. Anytime you make a scientific claim in any kind of marketing communication, you have to have credible scientific evidence backing it up. And when that scientific evidence comes from independent experts, it's much more effective. Now, will consumers recognize every third-party expert? Not necessarily. So you might have to do some educating of your consumers. So if you are partnering with a third-party organization to do something like certify that the wood you're using in your desks is from sustainable tree farm, you may have to do some work to educate your consumers about what that third-party certification really looks like. And I'll add that Amazon action is really new in the marketplace, and I think the jury is still out on how consumers are going to respond to it. They do have extensive information up on the webpage attempting to educate consumers. And if consumers out there are skeptical about it, I think we all just have to read the information and make a decision for ourselves on how credible we find it.
That's a great point. And I think something you said about midway through your talk was very important to me, at least, and that was this notion of what is the lay theory behind the assumption that consumers are making? What is the missing information that they're filling in based on that lay theory? I think if you could identify that, that may point you towards the type of information and maybe the sources that would be most credible. So I think that was a great heuristic for the audience to use as they think about what their communication challenge is. And to me, a related set of issues go back to this notion you mentioned at the outset about willful ignorance. There's been a lot of talk lately about political polarization, and some studies indicate that in social media, being exposed to the other side's argument may actually reinforce your own views rather than change your mind. And as you know, there's the well-established notion of reactance, consumers reacting negatively against some kind of persuasive attempt. So just maybe in broad terms from your experience, what are some of the ways you can get around those potential backfire issues or snapback? You know, taking one action that is deemed to be moral may entitle the consumer to do something else in another area that is less moral. So there's that kind of bookkeeping issue as well. So your thoughts about that kind of potential negative impact of some of these messages in the way that consumers, again, do that kind of balancing of the ethical activity?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that the motivated forgetting that I showed you for specific product attributes, I think that likely applies to consumers' behavior in their broader life, that we have maybe better memory for the time. Oh, yeah, I did buy that sustainable product. I did buy a shirt from that sustainable fashion brand. And we tend to forget our own unethical actions at a greater rate, but we really remember the good ones. So I think that that motivated forgetting happens for consumers. And as a result, we might think we're more ethical than we are, or as you pointed out, moral licensing is the name or the term that if we do something really good in one domain, we might then feel licensed to do more unethical things in other domains. And I think one solution to that, again, is just making ethical information more prevalent in the marketplace, because that maybe helps us to remember that when we bought that fast fashion item, that it wasn't the most ethical thing that we could have done. So seeing more ethical information would help with that. But unfortunately, in social media, you mentioned that as an issue. And we also see the denigration of more ethical consumers. We see that playing out in social media too, as you're talking about this polarization and people feeling like their sides. And I think the most important thing for a brand to remember is to try to communicate information in a way that's not going to threaten people that aren't yet on your side. You can look on Twitter and see examples of exactly what I showed you in our study of people saying, oh, the person who always has to buy the ethical product, they're preachy and odd and weird. And as a brand, it's hard. You don't want people to see your brand that way. So figuring out a way to build community around good choices and not shame consumers around bad choices is probably the best way to try to get people on board with the ethical argument without setting it up as this dichotomy that you're one type of consumer versus another. Sort of, we're all in this together. And it's interesting, you've seen a lot of that, we're all in this together, framing around the coronavirus. Can we use similar messaging? We're all in this together around climate change. We're not shaming people for not thinking about climate change, but sort of shifting people to think more about a community of taking positive action together.
That's interesting. There's a question by Robert. I'll actually read it to you. This is an interesting twist, perhaps, and I think it might relate to many people in the audience. He says, given the desire to avoid comparison to past unethical purchases, does it make sense to have a dedicated section of products in the store, say grocery, meat department, or paper goods, including only ethical options, changing the frame of reference to different ethical benefits? You talked about the things that will trigger the ethical mindset, and maybe the actual display in a store can be one way you do that.
Yeah, I think that is a great suggestion. And there's actually some research that I didn't share with you that suggests that when people are trying to think about which products to include, it's really easy to forget to think about ethical attributes. But it's when we think about which products to exclude, which ones we don't want, we actually are more likely to think about ethicality that way. And we're thinking about what we don't want. But naturally, consumers don't necessarily go through a store with exclusion in mind, right? We think about what to put in our cart. We don't think about what not to put in our cart. But creating those sections in stores basically does the exclusion work for consumers who really want to express their ethical values. They can just go to that section of the store. And it also may activate an ethical mindset, even in other consumers that aren't the ones that are very focused on expressing their values in the marketplace, because it might serve as a reminder. A lot of times when we're shopping, we're in a very concrete mindset, focusing on the here and now. What do I need to put in my cart for dinner right now? Staying safe, wearing my mask. We're not thinking about, big abstract things like the long-term impact of sustainable farming and climate change when we're doing our shopping, right? And so making it easier for people to think about those issues with a section like that, I actually do think would be highly effective. And I've seen it in some stores, but I don't see it that often in what I would call mainstream retailers.
Great. Paul had an interesting question. It said in the blanket example, do you expect consumers to be willing to take responsibility for offsetting the impact of the product? don't they see this as a manufacturer's responsibility? So it goes back a little bit to this, like, who do you shift the blame or the decision to? Maybe you forgive yourself by assuming the manufacturer really needs to take care of that. That's not something I as a consumer deal with. How do you make sure that the consumer sort of owns the issue, and then you can persuade them perhaps to take the ethical choice?
Well, right now, that particular app or the extension that we're working with, people have to choose to install it. So the people who choose to install it have already bought in to some extent to the idea that they want to mitigate the impact on climate change of their online shopping. In terms of if all of a sudden Amazon were to show that information to all their consumers, I think many consumers would simply ignore it. But that question of who should bear responsibility and who do consumers think should bear responsibility, I think is a really good question. And one of the things I want to look at in research on climate change information is what if brands were to, for example, offer to put money in a consumer's carbon offset wallet? Would that then lead consumers to buy it? Buy a product that the brand did that versus another brand did not, even if they're the same price, but if they feel like part of their money is going to climate change mitigation. Now, whether the brand's actually putting it towards climate change information, that gets back to the credibility issue. But this idea of understanding, are consumers willing to take some responsibility? Do they want manufacturers or retailers to take it? What does that look like? I think that those are all still really good, but really open questions.
There were some questions or comments that came in on the chat function, actually, and they relate to, I think, what we were just referring to in some ways, which is who is in a position to sort of enforce some of these regulations around, say, truth in advertising, truth in claims. An easy answer is to say, well, the government should step in and regulate, but that itself can generate controversies, as you know. But maybe stepping back from kind of the political issue to the actual psychology of consumers engaging around ethical behavior, to what extent do things like government regulations, you mentioned labeling requirements in one of your examples, to what extent do those actually affect consumer behavior? I suspect it's not as straightforward as we would like to think.
It's not. And if you look at something like food labeling behavior, so many of you have probably seen we now have calorie information on menus for any restaurant that has more than 20 outlets, I believe. And do people actually use that information? The answer to that is really complicated. Some people use it some of the time is the answer. That people who have enough health knowledge to understand it use it. People who have specific health and diet goals use it. But I still think, even though maybe the majority of consumers don't use it all the time, I still think having that information there is important, because for those consumers who are motivated to use it, before that was required by law, restaurants weren't putting it on there. And sometimes that it takes regulation to get information that could help consumers, to get it provided by all companies in an easy to understand format. That doesn't mean it has to come from the government. There are also examples of industry self-regulation. So like motion picture ratings is a great example of really successful industry self-regulation. Targeted ads online are, that's almost exclusively industry self-regulation. The ad choices icon indicating when something has been a behaviorally targeted ad using your personal data. So I think that the regulations can come from industry self-regulation, or they can come from policymakers, but without some kind of coordinated effort, it's really hard for consumers to understand it. I think standardization matters a lot, because without standardization, I showed you that Amazon Climate Pledge Friendly label. I don't know what that means, right? As a consumer, I don't know what that means. That's not a standard label that's being used across platforms. It's something that Amazon's created. And if each firm does that, it's really hard for consumers to compare across platforms and understand what it really means.
I think that's a great balanced response. We've got plenty of experience of where, with the best intentions, regulations don't always play out the way we intend, because consumers, as you say, have multiple sources of information, have to weigh one against the other. A couple of questions related to the example you gave on the hand sanitizer, and I want to again kind of interpolate two questions that came out of those observations or questions. One is the power of sort of social influence, broadly speaking. The notion that I'm being observed will change my behavior. And one question came up earlier about, does that, maybe again, example, the snapback or the license idea, do consumers in that scenario perhaps act differently, less ethically in a different context, having been observed to be ethical, reinforcing their self-perception? And just more broadly, the role of your social networks, your significant others' influences on you in enforcing this type of behavior, because obviously the ethical self-perception is not just a matter of your own sense of who you are, it's your sense of how you're seen by others. And I'm just wondering if there's some angles there, maybe broadly from your research and experience, about leveraging the impact of that social influence for ethical decision making.
Yeah, I feel like this is a question that I can actually answer with some good news, which is great, which is that social norms absolutely do influence consumers. And if consumers believe that it is the norm in their particular reference group to choose sustainable products, they are more likely to choose sustainable products. And there's some great academic research that's been done on the power of norms to influence sustainability. One of my favorites is a great example where you've seen probably the hotel towel reuse cards in hotels that say, please help us save water, hang the towel up if you will reuse it. Well, there were some field experiments done where it actually changed the content of the cards to say things like 75% of people who stayed in this hotel room chose to reuse their towels versus just the standard, please reuse your towels message. And that information about the social norm that most people who stayed in the room reused the towel significantly increased people's willingness to reuse the towel. And so the closer the norm is to you, so there was a very specific norm of people who had stayed in that hotel, in that room, the closer the norm is to you, the more powerful it is at influencing your behavior. But there's lots of examples of successfully using social norm-based interventions to increase sustainable behaviors in a variety of contexts. So I think that's one of the tools as marketers that we have in our toolbox. If we can truthfully say that, yes, there is a norm in this particular context to use a sustainable product, that can start shifting people to be more sustainable.
That's a great answer, I think, and a nice upbeat note to end on. I would also observe that reinforces the idea that your individual contribution is part of a group effort, which collectively can have an impact that you as an individual might not have. So it gives you, again, permission to take the action that you might otherwise see as futile if it was only you taking that particular action. So it's a great message to reinforce the behavior, and a great upbeat takeaway, I think, from your presentation. I want to thank Rebecca again and the audience for a great Q&A session. There will be a recording of this on our website soon. You'll be receiving a link with connections to that and to the slides. And again, you have Rebecca's contact information there. I'm sure she'll love to hear from you if you have additional questions. So with that, I want to thank the audience and again remind you that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. Thanks to all involved today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.